1958 was a somewhat tragic year in Buick history, as total sales for 1958 for Buick were just 240,659 units across the Special, Century, Super, Roadmaster, and the new for 1958 limited lineups. That was an abysmal showing, especially when compared with the 1957 sales for Buick, which were 404,040 units. And in just a few years prior, Buick was selling around 700,000 units and in third place, even ahead of Plymouth. So what was really happening in 1958 and what caused Buick sales to plummet so quickly? Well, one element was certainly the styling of these 1958 Buicks, which was especially, I guess you could call it, heavy and pudgy and doughy, especially when you juxtapose the Buick styling against other various vehicles in the marketplace, most prominently those from Chrysler Corporation. Chrysler had introduced its new forward look in 1957, and by 1958, the look was really taking hold with customers. In fact, it helped propel Plymouth back to the number 3 spot for 1957, taking it actually from, you guessed it, Buick, which had the number 3 spot in 1956. Plymouth sold 726,000 cars in 1957, but you have to remember that just a few years earlier, in 1955, Buick actually sold 738,000 cars. So its fall down to just 240,000 units for 1958 was a precipitous fall. And admittedly, 1958 production was relatively low for the industry overall, in part because of the economic climate at the time. But that really was no excuse for Buick division sales being a third of what they once were. Additionally, Buick division sales really hit that nadir despite the fact that a new nameplate was added to the lineup, the vehicle that you see here, the 1958 Buick Limited. The Limited was the long wheelbase Buick that rode atop 127.5-inch wheelbase, shared with the Super as well as the Roadmaster. By the way, the Special and Century rode atop the 122-inch smaller wheelbase. But the Limited was introduced to really restore some of the glory and luxury to Buick. It had a base price of $5,000-ish, $5,100, or the equivalent about $55,000 to $60,000 today. So it was a very expensive car indeed. Buick had priced it a few $100s below the comparable Cadillacs, and what seemed like overall a good move. And when the vehicle was planned, this was a time frame when really a lot of things that you saw in the marketplace had some element of flair to them. Well, the Limited, as you can see here, has a distinctly large amount of flair. Not only does it have the sweep spear, which was admittedly toned down slightly from the 1957 version, but it also has these strakes, I guess you would call them, 3 sets of 5 each for a total of 15, a super heavy and chunky rear bumper, and similarly chunky taillights, a rear quarter panel peak molding on it, and rocker panel moldings. The only thing that this vehicle is missing is portholes from it. But other than that, talk about putting the chrome on with a trowel. That is what happened on these 1958 Buicks. In fact, the chrome on the rear looks so heavy it almost appears that it could sink the whole car. That area underneath the strakes is especially heavy with chrome. And the overall vehicle just looks old and tired compared to what Chrysler in particular was presenting to the public at the time. I will say up front, there is a cool grille that has 160 beveled chrome-plated squares that look a bit like oversized cufflinks. And I think that is a unique detail that looks nice. Of course, you have the gun sights at the top of the fenders in the front as well. For 1958, Buick would get rid of the hated tri-part rear window, but overall, I would say the 1958 looks were not an improvement over the 1957 models. Now, if you're wondering how in the world did the Buick get so bedazzled for 1958, well, that was really a decision that was made by General Motors styling chief Harley Earl at the time. This was in the waning years of Harley Earl's career. He would retire after 1958. And apparently he came into the design studios and wasn't happy with the amount of so-called paraphernalia that the designers were originally proposing for the body sides. Let's listen into this audio interview with Hank Haga, who was then a stylist in the Buick studio working on the 1958 Buicks, as he describes an interaction with Harley Earl regarding their styling. Hank would later rise to become the chief of Chevrolet 2 and 3 studios from 1963 to 1974, and he worked on a number of sporty vehicles for Chevrolet, including the 1968 Corvette, the 70.5 Camaro, the Monza, and the mid-engine concept Corvettes like the Aerovet. He also would go on to lead Opel Design Studio in Germany. Let's hear Hank's recollection about this interaction with Harley Earl regarding the 1958 Buicks.
I remember once in Buick, and this was later on, Harley Earl came in. This was after Chrysler's clean line with the fins, and the issue here was a new Buick, and it was a 58. A 59 was being formed, but you still had to live through the 58, and you had the old body style, which was rather bulbous and heavy and not fleet like the Chryslers. I remember Harley coming in and saying, now guys, I want you to do a sweep spear, and I want you to do some hoop scoops, bubble bombs, Dagmars, portholes, and rockers, and chrome wheels, and I want you to do all those, and then I'll be back, and then we'll decide what we're going to do. And then he left. Clip, clop, clip, clop, clip, with these huge wingtips, you know, immaculately dressed, clip, clop. You could always hear his pace, clip, clop, clip, clop, and everybody'd freeze.
Slow measured.
Right. Came back the next day, and he says, Jesus Christ, fellas, you didn't hear me. You just got a sweep. Where's all the other paraphernalia? And, of course, it was hanging on the boards all over. He says, no, why don't you do what I say? Pull it all on. So we put every kind of chrome piece we could on that side view rendering. And he says, there, guys, now you got it. Clip, clop, clip, walked out. And we all looked at each other. He's serious. This is it. This is a go to press. And if you remember the 58 Buick, it had everything on it. Well, he never explained his merchandising philosophy. He didn't have to. He dealt with the top brass, you know. We were just his servants. So, yeah, right. And I guess, who knows if it helped the sales, or I guess it might have, because there was enough dash and glamour on it.
Yeah, Dagmars.
Yeah, Dagmars. Yes, right. All kinds of, you know, everything. Just loaded up, put ornaments.
That's fascinating.
Well, and there you have the story of how the 1958 Buick styling came to be almost accidental, if you take Hank's recount there at its face value. Apparently, the designers really never intended to have all of these doodads on the vehicle, but that's what Harley Earl said he wanted, and that's what he ended up getting. And consequently, you get a vehicle that looks like this. Now, that isn't to say that the 1958 Buicks are bad cars. In fact, overall, they're quite nice vehicles to drive. And actually, there were a number of innovations introduced for 1958 for these Buicks that were pretty interesting. The first was that the 1958 Buicks were the first year that Buick had its finned aluminum drums standard across the entire lineup. These were actually introduced in the 1957 Roadmaster, but for 1958, they were outfitted across the entire Buick lineup. And for those who don't know, these Buick aluminum fin drums, they were made of aluminum on the outside. They had a cast iron liner, and they dissipated heat quite well. They actually were some of the best brakes to be used on vehicles, certainly best drum brakes of the era. And Buick used them for many years, all the way up until the early 1970s. So that was really a great invention that was a Buick exclusive all the way through to the end of their run. A less successful feature on the 1958s was the introduction of the so-called air poise ride or suspension system that had double rubber bellows that were filled with pressurized air. It was actually a system that was, I believe, developed by Cadillac. And the air pressure into the bellows was controlled by various valves that helped maintain a level ride stance in the front and the rear of the vehicle. So the air ride was not just in the rear, it was also in the front. Now, the air springs actually took up the space where coil springs normally would ride. There were not coil springs on these air-poised cars. So it really was the entire suspension system. And unfortunately, it was leak-prone and failure-prone. They just did not work well. And for 1959, the air-poised ride was made only available in the rear as opposed to being front and rear like it was in 1958. And then it was dropped completely after the 1959 model year. Under hood, Buick's got an excellent V8 engine for 1958. This would be the 364 cubic inch nailhead V8. This was the second generation nailhead engine in Buick V8s that was introduced in 1957 and produced through the 1966 model year in various displacements, including the 364 cubic inch displacement that was found under hood in the 1958 Buicks, the later 401 that was introduced in 1959 and produced through 1966, and later the 425 that was introduced in 1963 and produced in 1966. The 364 was really an excellent engine. Here you can see Buick called it humorously the B12,000 engine. And, I guess that they had some rationale for it, that it says in the brochure it was called the B12,000 from the fact that it develops a thrust of 12,000 pounds behind every piston as it is fired. Well, whatever. It's kind of a interesting nomenclature. Although these Buicks themselves were known as the airborne B58 Buick. So clearly there was some sort of flight inspiration in these vehicles. Well, at least Buick tried to associate the vehicles with flight, if you will. But the Nailhead was a great engine. It's funny here, you'll notice that it mentions a quadrajet carburetor, but this was not the quadrajet carburetor that would be introduced in the mid-1960s by GM. Nonetheless, the engines were pretty powerful overall. The standard engine was 250 horsepower. That was employed in the Buick Special with a lower 9.5 to 1 compression ratio. And then in the Limited, the Roadmaster, the Super, the Century, they all had a 10 to 1 compression ratio, 300 horsepower, 4-barrel V8 nailhead engine. One other interesting thing about these Buicks under hood is that they introduced the so-called flight pitch Dynaflow transmission for 1958. Buick had introduced a variable pitch stator in 1955, but for 1958, this new flight pitch Dynaflow actually had a stator that had an infinite number of potential positions as opposed to just 2 or 3. So it could really assist with takeoff and with basically helping the Dynaflow transmission be more efficient. Unfortunately, it was quite complicated and relatively failure prone to the point that Buick's chief engineer said that this almost broke us, quote unquote, and it wouldn't stay around very long. This flight pitch Dynaflow and the triple turbine Dynaflow would only be around through the 1959 model year before they would be sunset in favor of Buick's twin turbine transmission. Now let's turn to the interior for a moment, because I think this is one area where the 1958 Buicks really excelled, particularly on the upper end trims, like the Limited that you see here, which really had a rich and beautiful interior. These seats obviously have lots of button tufting, which also adorns the door panels. The seats had double foam cushions in the front. The instrument panel obviously has a ton of gleaming chrome and some interesting controls. The left little circular pod there is the light control. The right circular pod to the right of the steering column is the HVAC controls. But it just looks beautiful and very space age, clearly inspired by jets of the era. And that was in keeping with the name of these Buicks, the B58 Buicks. You can also see this car has the automatic headlamp dimmer that is up on top of the instrument panel. And it has the optional push-button radio control. You'll notice there's 2 buttons there down in the floor. Well, one is to change the radio. The other is to change the bright lights. So some cars of the era had that. It's kind of an interesting feature. But overall, just a rich interior and one that's especially tasteful. And here you can see a close-up of the instrument cluster. Notice the rotating drum speedometer, that you were able to read the speed as that drum rotated, and that painted line would move further and further across the speedometer the faster you drove the vehicle. Also got a full complement of gauges in these Buicks: the coolant temperature gauge, oil pressure, the amp meter, as well as the fuel gauge. On the left, as I mentioned, you have the control for the lights. On the right, you have the various HVAC controls. So all in all, despite the not so attractive exterior, at least in my personal opinion, I think some people really like these Buicks, and that's fine. Everybody's got different tastes. They're good cars. I actually like the front end a little bit. It's that rear end with that really heavy bumper and chrome trim that just looks off to me on these vehicles. Despite all that, they are really good vehicles, and if you have a chance to own one at a reasonable price, I would definitely recommend it. Just be prepared that that flight pitch transmission isn't the best, and it's probably getting hard to find somebody to service them. Let's close out with a few photos of what the 1958 Buick might have looked like. And these photos show clay models from the General Motors design studios at the time. And I got to tell you, while I don't love the production 58 Buick, I really don't love these clay models. So let's take a look. And here is the first photo of a proposal for the 1958 Buick from GM's design studios, clearly inspired by the LeSabre show car of a few years earlier. But oh my goodness, what an absolutely horrid design. Take a look at that propeller up front there underneath the, I guess you could call it, oversized nose of the hood. And this extremely exaggerated sweep spear that not only is found in the body side trim, but you see a little bit of a sweep spear also in the doors. Not exactly sure what's going on with that hood there beyond it just being inspired by the LeSabre show car, where I think it was much more fitting. And by the way, on that LeSabre show car, the headlamps were included in a rotating assembly in that, I guess, nose, if you want to call it. Here, obviously, there's quad headlights, two on either side of the vehicle. But that bumper looks awful with those pointy, what were called Dagmars at the time, and that, I guess, propeller similar to what Studebaker had, and that piece from the LeSabre concept car, and maybe even the headlights that look a little bit like the Buick Wildcat show car of a few years earlier. It's just an absolute disaster. And the body side and the roofline also is just, I would say, uninspired. Again, imagine this is something designers were looking to put on the road. At the same time, Chrysler had those beautiful cars with the tall fins and the thin roofs and the beautiful body side sculpture. This would have just been an abomination in the marketplace. But that's what happens sometimes when you give designers free rein, as opposed to putting tons of cost constraints on them. They come up with stuff like this. And here's the rear of the same proposal. And this is, as opposed to a face only a mother could love, which you just saw, this is a rear, I guess, only a mother could love too. Boy, is this thing ugly. I don't even know how to describe it. It has the exhaust coming out of the bumper as well as kind of an egg crate pattern texture beneath that. And there's these, I guess, it looks like they should have been taillights, but they're not. I'm guessing that those forms on the top of the rear quarter panel are just that. They're decorative pieces with stainless accent trim. And you have the reverse lights, and I'm guessing the main taillights, they're outboard of that. The roof has kind of this barbell theme similar to what would appear on the 66 Tornado and some of the Oldsmobiles, at least on the hood of them, where you have the narrow section in the middle and then it bulges out toward the edge. And these fake vents, similar to what the 58 Impala would have in the rear, but that would only be a single fake vent in the center. It looks like here Buick might have had two. Overall, like I said, I can't imagine if GM had released this, what the public's reaction would have been. This, to me, is very hard on the eyes, to say the least. Not quite sure what designers were thinking, but very thankful that that didn't make it through to production. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the 1958 Buicks, and if you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching.